Often overlooked is the story behind the storyteller, and we're going to change up that trend as one of the key journalists in sports media joins me in Jon Wertheim, who, of course, you see CBS, Tennis Channel, Sports Illustrated, the list goes on. Jon, I'm excited to tell your story. I know you've written a few books. We're going to try to write a book about you in audio form in a couple of minutes here. How about that?
An audiobook. I'm all for it. No, good to be here. Thanks, Brian. I appreciate it, and go wherever you want to go.
Yeah, so I'm Bryan Fenley. Just started as a commentator for Tennis Channel. Obviously, you know what Jon has done with tennis. Jon, how strong of a writer were you in middle school?
You know what? The math felt like homework, and science felt like homework. It just never felt like it just never felt like so I don't know how good I was per se, but I did recognize pretty early that when you had to write a page for English or you had to write a paper, it was a much different sensation than, oh, you've got this problem set, or oh, you've got to list the 50 world capitals.
The idea of being a good historian as well, how early do you remember being interested and enthralled in history, and not just maybe knowing that writing was a key component of what you enjoyed?
Oh man, these are great questions. Definitely. I used to enter these essay contests. It's sort of like the Abraham Lincoln essay contests, and there was, I don't know, $50 for the winner kind of thing. And my friends were like, God, nerd, like, what are you thinking? and I always thought it wasn't like I was, it wasn't like resume padding, or it just the same way I enjoyed playing tennis and basketball. It just seemed like it was kind of fun. And you'd go and you'd poke around about the treason trials of the 1860s, or about William Seward, and then you had to write it up. And I always liked history. I always liked reading history. It never felt like homework. It felt more like playing basketball. It just felt like something that sort of, the time went fast and I seemed to enjoy it. And yeah, so I always really liked history, and not even like, oh, I actually ended up being a history major in college, but it wasn't even like, this is what I want to be when I grow up. It was more like a hobby. It just, it just seemed like something that was fun to do.
For as much as you have enjoyed history and have found that is really a integral part of what you want to be around, as far as telling the stories of others and knowing about things around you, how much time do you spend examining your own history? You're always busy looking at other people's histories and writing up books, and the Nadal and Federer and the all-time matchup they had, and all the other stuff that you've done from a historical standpoint. But the idea of focusing on your own history, how much time of thought do you put into that?
Minimal, none. Very little. I mean, part of it is I don't live where I grew up, so I don't have these sort of immediate stimuli, and some of it is just too busy with other stuff. Very little. I don't do a lot of residing in the past.
The idea of, as your career got going and in your humble beginnings, what are the key components that you have, Jon, that have helped you through this process gain the respect of your peers, gain the respect of those in media? What have you done to ensure that and to grow your brand and what you can do in the media space?
Oh man, I mean, it's very flattering to hear that. I don't know. I mean, I try to, we try to treat people well. I mean, I know how much I benefited, like in my 20s, from colleagues that took an extra minute, or someone that gave me a phone number, or someone that gave me a story idea, and in a really, really short amount of time, you turn into that person where you look around the room and you're like, shit, I'm the oldest person around this table. Or someone comes up to you and says, oh, I used to read you when I was in high school. And, I mean, I think some of this is Midwest upbringing. Some of this is sort of being lucky enough. I mean, I think I probably benefited starting at Sports Illustrated. I sort of, I was like a summer intern there and started there. So I never really had to mean, I always try to hustle in different ways, but I never had to hustle in the sense of like, you start off in a small market and go to a medium market, hope you get noticed. I think that probably allowed me to, to skip a few steps.
Mhm.
But I don't know. I mean, at the end of the day, also, it's kind of about the work. And they're really nice people who, maybe cut some corners or don't do amazing work. And they're also people that do amazing work, but don't treat their colleagues particularly well. So I think you sort of try to, you try not to be a jackass, but also try to let the work speak for itself.
Growing up in the Midwest, how did that toughen you up and prepare you for where you are now?
I'm pretty soft. Don't get me wrong. No, I mean, I think a few things. I think one of them, I grew up in Southern Indiana. It was a college town, so I don't want to, it wasn't necessarily rural, but I'm sure less than half my high school class graduated from college, and on my school bus, you had all sorts of kids, and you live in the woods, so you just these kind of skills and Cub Scout type skills and tying knots and learning to drive stick and all these things. And now that I'm I think about it a lot with my kids who grow up in the middle of Manhattan, and they have a lot of advantages and access and food and culture that I didn't have, but they also didn't have, hey, go spend 3 hours at the creek and try to, catch a fish with this net. I think that you learn to relate to a lot of different type of people. There wasn't a lot of diversity in the sense that we think of diversity sort of classically today. I mean, there wasn't a lot of ethnic diversity, there wasn't a lot of racial or religious diversity, but it was a lot of diversity in terms of people. And it was entirely possible that the guy sitting next to you in shop class lived in a barn, and it was entirely possible that the guy sitting next to you on the school bus had no intention of going to college. So I think that has helped me kind of part of that is really a part they don't tell you about. They tell you in journalism about asking the right questions and
Sure.
trying to improve your writing. They don't talk to you a lot about rapport actions and build relationships and relate to people. Story last week out in LA on a band. And the story I had on 60 Minutes last week was on like these people that prep for the end of the world and the apocalypse. I mean, those are two very different kind of, what's going to build a relationship with the lead singer of a band that everyone knows is going to be a lot different than what's going to kind of build some trust and rapport with a woman that lives in the Smoky Mountains and grows her own vegetables because the rapture is coming. And I think that growing up in the Midwest, you kind of, you met a lot of different people. You sort of had to be open-minded. Again, it wasn't classic diversity in like the college admission sense, but you met a lot of really different people. And if you could figure out ways to relate to all of them, that was going to help you. And I think that's something that I kind of got an early, it wasn't like intentional. I mean, just,
Sure.
we are, geography is destiny, and we are the sum of our experiences. It wasn't like I was 12 years old saying, boy, it's going to come in handy that I know how to have a conversation with this kid next to me on the school bus who has motor oil on his hands and has no interest in going to college. But you just kind of learn to deal with a lot of different people.
Well, and I think in learning and picking up on what you're saying, Jon, developing that empathy gene and being empathetic to whatever that person is next to you and whatever walk of life, as you said, there were people that were all involved in multiple different things, and you never knew where that walk of life was going to go or what they would end up being. But the idea of being a dad, how has that upped your empathy gene and made you a better writer and made you a better understander, and that's not even a word, but just have a better sense of the interviewee and what it takes to really get to the root of what they're trying to convey from their own story?
These are good questions. I think some of it is just practical, right? But I think one way I became a better writer is like, you've got kids running around or your kids have a game that I would say, first off, just being a dad really helped with time management. And like when your kids are sick or they've got to get to school or they have a game, you got to get your work done. And you can't have the luxury of writer's block, and you can't have the luxury of tooling around on the internet. Like, you've got to get stuff done. I'm an empty nester now, and I feel like I have all sorts of time because I don't have to like sit on bleachers or go. No one needs help with homework, and there are no school performances. But the other thing is, when you have kids, you realize that you might know what 6 times 6 is, but they don't, and they don't care how smart you are. You've got to figure out a way to convey that. And I think that's really helpful for a journalist, that you're not doing, it doesn't do me any good to say, not only do I know 6 times 6, I know 9 times 9, I know 6 cubed. That does me no good. I've got to figure out how to relate this information and tell it to my kids. And so I think it's really easy sometimes to kind of, I call it playing air guitar. Like, you write something fancy, but it doesn't really, it's not in service of the viewer. It's not in service of the reader. It's not in service of the audience. It's kind of like, when you got to teach your kids the alphabet and you tell them all the fancy words, what JK and L are, but if they don't, it doesn't help you to like, you've got to make it relatable to them. And I think that's something that I try to think more about as a writer, as a storyteller, as someone conveying facts, that you need to make the audience the priority, and it's not about showing off for how smart you are.
So well said. And Jon Wertheim is with me. I'm Bryan Fenley. The idea as well of relating and then getting them to open up in beautiful ways in a conversation that maybe in an interview, Jon, you had an idea of where you were going to take it, but then they said something and you ran with that. Being self-aware of having no idea where the interview is going, but being open to that. How do you deal with that idea of just being available to wherever the conversation goes, because it's authentic, it's real, and it could lead to some beauty coming out of it?
I think listening is so important. And I think there's this instinct. I mean, I was terrible at this because I think my first, especially like when I was younger and less secure, your instinct is to like, you want to be friends and show how cool you are and show you've done your homework and sort of show that you can show your work.
Sure.
And you don't listen. You're so busy trying to convince the subject that like, hey, I really know about sports. Hey, I really know tennis. Hey, you're so busy dropping factoids or trying to make it conversational. I mean, sometimes the best interviews I've had are just getting out of the way and asking, why is that? How come? Give me an example. And you don't get to show off, and you don't get to go home and say, oh, I bonded so much with Martina Hingis or whatever it is, but it leads to the better interview. And I think it's really, I mean, some of it, obviously, it's very situational and very case specific. I mean, if you've got 60 minutes and you've got cameras and you've got, if the athlete says you can have 20 minutes in the locker room before the game, that's a much different interview from, hey, come to my house and ask any questions you want. I think some people are like, I don't even go in there with questions. I just let the conversation go wherever I want. I'm not sure that's great advice. I mean, I think you need to have some kind of structure, but I think you also need to listen. And if someone says, whatever. I mean, I had one interview and said, you have your list of questions. And if someone says, when I had a traumatic experience when I was 3,
Yeah.
you don't say, great, what was the name of your pet? Like, I think
Yes.
sometimes you hear these interviews and you're like, whoa. Like,
Yeah.
I know you've got 20 questions written down that you want to go through, but someone just said something really, someone just said something kind of really important and impactful and jarring, and you got to kind of follow up and run with it. So I think it's a mix. I mean, I think if you go in there with no game plan and just, hey, we're going to have a free flowing conversation, I'm not sure that's great advice, but you need to listen to what the other person's saying. And if they take the conversation in an unexpected direction, great, like go there with them. Don't look back down at your piece of paper and say, oh, question 12,
Exactly.
tell me about your relationship with your mom. But anyway, it's, I mean, I still haven't mastered it. I mean, you do hundreds and hundreds of these and you still leave every interview saying, shit, I wish I'd done that a little different, or I didn't cut them off. I should have cut them off. Why didn't I follow up? I mean, it's an imperfect art by nature.
So that idea of self-review afterwards, and you think about an athlete and they're doing the same thing after a match or after a game, and they're going through what they did right, what they did wrong, what they need to do to get better. How would you compare and find similarities between the way an athlete, let's say that Nadal comes off the court and he suffers a defeat and he's thinking about what he needs to do better next time, and the way in which you are mentally processing things following an interview with someone?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes you just honestly don't have time. Like you've got to get your story done, and you can't do the equivalent of watching film.
Sure.
I usually when an interview doesn't go quite as you had hoped, that's when I'm more likely to sort of look at the transcript, or even in 60 minutes, like watch the tape. And sometimes, I mean, the other thing you realize is that sometimes something you think was a great exchange wasn't, and something that you don't even remember having happened. I mean, at least I guess it's probably similar to sports. I mean, I'm sure there's some athletes that say, "Shit, I don't even remember hitting that. That was a great kick serve I hit at 4-all
Yeah.
second serve." And sometimes I think it's the same way with an interview, where sometimes you'll use something in a story that you don't even remember asking, and other times you tell your friends about an exchange, but you didn't ask the question cleanly, or it didn't quite mesh with your recollections. So it's probably not dissimilar to sports. And then, like any athlete, there sort of becomes this question of, look, how much do I want to beat myself up? How much time do I have? Hey, I have a match the next day. I can't obsess with watching last night's tiebreaker. Other times you've got more time. So I mean, some of it's just sort of situational.
And also, John, going off what you're saying, I would think that in the situation that you're in, even though you can't totally listen to being a perfectionist, I would think that those thoughts are fleeting thoughts that come through your mind when you're doing a piece. You want to make it great, right? And you know that you have a finite amount of time to do this, to put this together, hit a deadline, only a certain amount of time with the interviewee. So how do you maneuver this idea of perfectionism in the business, just to not, like you said, beat yourself up all the time?
No, it's hard, and I think so look. Sometimes I did a story this week. I guess I can. This isn't live. We'll
No,
get a
no,
few
no,
days.
not live.
I'm doing a story on RG3, on Robert Griffin, and he was great, but I didn't get everything I needed. But I had his phone number and called him 2 days later, and I was able to sort of get a second bite of the apple. Got everything I needed. Great. Other times, I mean, I don't. Who I have a huge amount of respect for is people that do live TV.
Yeah,
It's a total, even when I do Tennis Channel and do these courtside interviews, which are not like, not 60 minutes with profound, somebody walks off the court, you don't say, tell me about your relationship with your mother. Like
yeah,
but you get, there's no, I mean, 60 minutes, you could have a great interview. And if you ask a couple questions that are duds, no one finds out about it. It's not live. You're sort of picking, same with doing a
sure.
print story, right? I mean, I can have a terrible interview with, pick an athlete, with Serena Williams, and if she gives me 3 good sound bites, great, we got a story. I have a lot of respect for people that do live interviews, because when you can cut around, you can mask mistakes, and if there are exchanges that something gets lost in translation, you edit those out. And if there's some dud sound bites, and if you stumble or they say you like and too many times, you just don't use it. When you're sitting there on a set, or we do this at Tennis Channel, somebody comes to the set and it's live TV, and it's a much different drill, in a lot of ways much more challenging. You don't have, I mean, you'd rather have, I'm trying to think, not 90 minutes with Viola Davis, and you can go to all sorts of places and talk about childhood. And it's a lot different to do that than Novak's coming to the set and you got 3 questions. Live TV is a lot harder. And the people that master the interview format live without the luxury of taping and cutting around it, and editors, and even audio editors on podcasts, that to me doesn't get enough credit.
You said, John, you got to be a good listener. And then when you're doing these post-match interviews on the court after a match, you have to be a good watcher of the match to know what the storyline is and what you're going to ask. So when you get, like you said, maybe 3 questions as far as the amount of time you're able to meet with the winner after the match, what sort of things are you sorting through in your mind to maybe hang on to when you're watching a match? What goes through the checklist as to say, okay, maybe I'll bring this up in the post-match interview, or maybe this was a key part? Like, what goes through that for you mentally to decide on what you ultimately want to say and get across in those conversations?
It's a great. I mean, I think I'll say 2 things. One, we talked about being a good listener, but it's really beyond that. It's kind of being just present and noticing body language and tone and eyes, and sometimes listening is key, but so is just kind of reading the room. And even in those situations, sometimes players walk off the court and you get the sense the last thing they want to do is answer these goddamn questions. And other times you get the feeling they're like, oh yeah, I would love to relive this great triumph. I'm more than happy to discuss what I did. And some of that also, it helps to know the players. So, Serena is one way, even after wins, and you kind of know she had her choice. She wouldn't be there. It's short, it's sweet. She doesn't really care about the X's and O's. You'll get a better answer talking about, music and food and tennis and fashion than you will saying at 3-all you hit that kick serve. And that's just sort of knowing the subject. Other athletes, are more willing to talk and more inclined to talk about the X's and O's. Some of it is the match itself, right? If a match ends 6-1, 6-1, it's a much different interview than if they are 90 seconds removed from winning a decisive set tiebreaker and their neurochemistry is going through the roof. And a lot different vibe than, hey, Ego won 6-1, 6-1. Sometimes with those interviews, there's a teeny bit of time, like you're in commercial. Sure. Or they're changing the mic cap so it says Tennis Channel. And sometimes I'll try and use that 20 seconds just to get a sense, whether it's, hey, you're wearing a Ukraine pin on your hat. Are you cool if I ask you about your feelings about Ukraine? Or, are you cramping? Or are you holding up okay physically? Just something to get a vibe about sort of how this is going to go and how inclined they are to speak, or if they just want to make this short and sweet. And then the things in the match is really, it's interesting, but a lot of times it's just so player dependent. And there's some players who know, Roger Federer knows every point, right? And if you said, hey, tell me about that point at Deuce in the 3rd game, he would say, well, he hit a short angle backhand that I ran around the forehand. Other players have no recollection of anything. So sometimes it's just kind of knowing the cast of characters and knowing also which players. Some players love geeking out on tennis, and other players, they want to talk about their brand. They want to. Sloane Stephens she's great talking about walking around the city and what else she's up to and how was her flight. And the minute you say anything related to tennis, you could sort of see her. Oh boy, I gotta talk shop now. And other players are the exact opposite. So sometimes it's looking for that key moment. I mean, obviously, whatever. If there's a fist fight in the 3rd game, you got to ask about it. If they had one game when they only hit aces, you might ask about it. But a lot of times it's just so dependent on these players. And that's one nice thing about tennis is you kind of get a sense pretty fast of who's good, who's bad, who's boring, who needs a little bit of energy, who needs, one softball question to get going, who's bang right from the start. And you learn that pretty fast. But again, what's a good question to player X might be toxic to player Y. And just kind of through experience, you try your best to figure out who's who.
That's such a good point. And I think you brought up really something interesting. And it's that as you said, that 20, maybe 30-second window before when there's a commercial, before they throw it down to you for the interview, where you could just say something just to get familiar with the person and develop a little bit of a rapport. And as you said, the people at home don't understand, but because they're not seeing this, but that could really change the dynamic and tone of the interview. What about in Jon, as we wrap this up here, and I mean, I could go on forever. This is, I mean, I'm learning so much from you, and I know you got a lot going on. But hopefully, one of these days our paths will cross in person. But just because I know your time is of the essence, how about when you're working or talking or interviewing an athlete in defeat, and how it's different from the way in which you're going to the winner afterwards, and what do you go through to be that empathetic self that you've really grown to be?
I think the first thing, I mean, you're talking one-on-one and sort of not a press
Yeah,
conference,
one
but
on one.
I think the first thing you do is sort of acknowledge the situation and, hey, Bryan, before we get going, it's really good of you to stop. I know this wasn't the result you wanted, but I think it's really good of you to give us some time. I mean, I think you sort of acknowledge,
Yeah,
it was a disappointing day. And not only that, but that sort of, you're almost implying like not everyone does this. So good on you. And then, I mean, I think you just try to find empathy and try to say, boy, if I had a shitty day at work, how inclined would I be to deconstruct it with someone else for the world to hear? At some level, it's part of sports, right? I mean, it's part of the drill. I mean, I have sympathy. I don't want to say limited, but I have a finite amount of sympathy, because I do think, look, I mean, you enter this business and it's binary, and there are wins and there are losses. And if, you can't only take the victory lap, sometimes you need to sort of, I mean, Novak Djokovic is a great example of this. He understands defeat, and he's very sort of philosophical and accessible in defeat. And I think there's an acknowledgement of, look, I mean, I get my share of victory laps, but I entered this line of work when there's a D on that line score. And sometimes I'm going to be on the right, and sometimes I'm going to be on the left. And you can't only talk when it's triumph, but you also have to balance that with this recognition of like, yeah, the person hasn't had a great day, and it didn't go the way they wanted, and they're not happy with themselves, and there might be other things going on that day in their lives that contributed to the defeat. So I am trying to, sort of like empathy, but it's not unconditional empathy, because I do think, look, if you don't like competition and you don't like losing, you're in the wrong line. I mean, you don't accept losing, you're in the wrong line of work. It's sort of the nature of sports. But I also get that not too many of us would be thrilled to have a microphone put in our face the day we lost and didn't have a good day at the office.
The reading of the room, Jon, is I think what you do so well at. And no matter how the person is feeling, as you said, what they're going through, how this is all going to work, because you have a rapport with these athletes beforehand, whether in defeat, whether in a winning scenario, and you're able to get them to say things that they're not going to say to anybody else, because of your ability to really know what to say in whatever moment. And like you said, it depends upon the person, and having those antennas up to know that is why, you're so successful and have done so many great things and will continue to do in this business. Jon Wertheim with Tennis Channel, CBS, Sports Illustrated, the list goes on. I'm Bryan Fenley, commentator for TC. This was so fun, Jon. I really appreciate this, and I could keep going, but I'm so grateful for your time, and this was really a fun conversation.
No, likewise. We'll do part 2 sometime. But
Yes.
no, those are great questions. I appreciate that.